Well, it's very good to see all of you this morning. Appreciate you coming out and being in attendance with us and to partake in the other elements of our assembly. Thank Adrian for the prayer that he led and Jordan for leading us in our singing. This morning we're going to be discussing from our Corinthian study a point that certainly needs to be developed when we are considering trying to discuss and be evangelistic with those that are lost around us. But also, we need to have these things brought to our remembrance so that we ourselves do not start to elevate any certain thing or any elements above that which is given to us as our area of salvation, and that being ultimately the cross and the blood of Christ. But as we're looking at this information this morning, wanting to discuss God's one scheme of redemption. Now, this is a important point because there is a certain group out in the religious world, they call themselves dispensationalists, where they would view the different things that are written in the Bible, which certainly we have different laws and different commandments given to different time periods, dispensations. So the word dispensation is found in the scripture. It's just not within the terminology in which they like to use. But even the religious world, they do not properly understand that, okay, this Bible is actually broken up into 3 different sections. Most people would think, well, it's just the Old Testament and New Testament. But in fact, there's a time section, there's a time frame leading up from the creation of man and woman, Adam and Eve, up to the point where we have the law of Moses being given, where the majority of people would consider that being the Old Testament. There were different laws and different rules given to Adam and Eve, to their children, to Noah, to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and for that matter, even Job. Job finds himself in the time frame of the patriarchs, even though his book is placed way later chronologically in what we have as our Old Testament. You had a different set of rules for Abraham than you did from the time frame of Moses. And we today find ourselves in a different time frame with different rules and commandments than all of them. But there still is a key factor that is going to be the same throughout all of those. And that this has always been the way in which God has said that man is going to be saved. So this one scheme of redemption, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 7, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory. And we discussed in our time class period just a moment ago how that this is in fact dealing with, this context is dealing with the plan of redemption. How is man going to be saved? Paul is emphasizing we're not preaching the wisdom of men, but we are preaching the wisdom of God. And that the power of God and the preaching of the cross is going to be salvation to those that will obey it. So when we're considering how it is that man is going to be saved, or how man has been saved, God has never had but one scheme of redemption. God has saved every person throughout history the same way. Now, to some, hearing us say that, they might view that as a strange thing for us to be actually proclaiming, but it is true. There's going to be one, or at least one key factor throughout every account where man is saved. Some of the details are going to be different, but there's going to be one key element that we're going to study this morning that brings all of these things together. And it's for this reason that we have examples like Abel, Abraham, Moses, and David, and we're going to study some of these characters this morning. If they're not saved the same way that we are, and we're not saved the same way that they were, then how can they even be used as examples? I mean, that's the whole point of an example, is to where you are able to follow what they did so as to, get to a desired end. So if they are in fact our examples, then we are going to be saved the same way those men were. So let's start looking at some of these individuals this morning. When we're considering how it is that all men are going to be saved, and how these characters in the Old Testament, how they were saved, all men are saved by the law of faith. The law of faith has operated through different commands, different ways, and in different dispensations, but it is still the same law. And thus that's what you have Paul stating in Romans chapter 4 and verse 16. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace. Every man that sins has to be saved by grace. There is no other way. And we're going to make connection from this point in just a moment, a little bit later on when we start looking at the Old Testament law. If man sins, the penalty for sin is death. But the fact that man can sin and yet still be saved is proof within itself that it has to be done by God's grace. It cannot be done by anything that we can do within ourselves, because we stand guilty. We stand condemned. So what needs to step in? God's grace needs to step in. And since no man can be saved but by grace, the only way that grace saves is by faith. And that's Romans 4:16. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace. But we understand when we're dealing with the Bible concept or the Bible idea, terminology of faith, that is not simply just mental assent, or that I'm just saying in my head, okay, I believe. Faith is going to show itself. Faith is going to bring about some performance. Faith is going to bring about obedience. So point number 2, when we're considering salvation by faith, and that is the law that has run all the way through the scriptures, faith has been expressed differently in each dispensation or each time frame. Just consider here in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it, by faith, the elders obtained a good report. So we're starting this grand chapter about the importance of faith. And the Hebrew writer begins by discussing the elders who have obtained a good report by faith. Well, who are these elders? These are those individuals under the Old Testament system. These are the people that have come before us. And we are looking at what the Hebrew writer says, and notice how the Hebrew writer says that they were saved. How they obtained a good report. They obtained a good report by faith. You mean not by keeping the law? Well, not keeping the law alone. And even in this situation where we're discussing how that they're being saved by faith, they're not being saved by faith alone. That word alone is not anywhere in this context, but when people read these passages and they see it, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, for by it, by faith, the elders obtained a good report. Some would want to jump to that and say, well, see there, that's faith alone. Well, we know that's not by faith alone from what we read in the Old Testament. And even with the examples that we're going to look at here in just a moment, these individuals are not being saved by faith alone. So how were they saved? Were they saved by hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized in water for the remission of sins? No, they weren't. Because those commands were not given yet. But they're still being saved by faith just like we are. They're being saved by faith by being obedient to those things that they were being told to do during their time frame. So some examples of their saving faith. I mean, you have Abel. Hebrews 11, verse 1. We're trying to find out this scheme. How is it all played out? How is it by faith? By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous. If individuals would just read this information and read it accordingly, appropriately, the writer starts out by discussing that by faith the elders received a good report. And if you just read a little bit further, you would find examples of how a person finds a good report by faith. By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice. So that's not faith alone. His faith did something. And the Bible shows us that these two things going together, he obtained witness that he was righteous. So when we are saying that we are being saved by the law of faith, That is faith or trust in whatever it is that God has said that a person needs to do so that they can be found to be righteous. We have it being shown to us that Abel was a righteous man. But Abel was not righteous because of meritorious works. He did not come up with the idea one day that, you know what, I'm just going to sacrifice a lamb. I think that will make God happy. He did not do that. God told him what he wanted, and Abel complied. He had faith in what God said. By faith, expressed in atoning blood when he offered the sacrifice. And what's the conclusion? What's the end? He obtained a good report. He obtained witness that he was righteous. How was Abel saved by faith? How are we saved today? It's by being obedient to what God has said. But my faith, now here's the caveat or the transition. My faith does not obey the same commands that Abel had. I do not have to go out here and sacrifice a lamb so that I can be found righteous. But I do have to have faith in the one sacrifice that was once offered for all. There are commands that go along with it, just like with Abel. Abel had commands. He had rules that he had to follow. And thus he was found to be righteous. Moving on to Abraham. Abraham is described as being the father of the faithful. What is said about him in this great chapter of faith? By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. The faith that Abraham had was not something that was inactive. The faith that Abraham had, that we are to have as examples today, was involved in action. He was doing. The very fact that it says he was saved by faith, how? When he was called to go into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. There's the answer. How is a person saved by faith? When they obey. And if you do not have faith, guess what? You're not going to obey. But to start looking at the fact, well, Abraham obeyed, so then therefore he gets to brag before God. No, it says very clearly that God called him. There's no bragging in that. Abraham doesn't get any credit. He didn't concoct any of this plan. He's just simply doing what God said to do. And it said that he does it by faith. So here we have the father of the faithful. He is called the friend of God. And what do we have being said about him? James chapter 2 and verse 22, seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect, whole or complete. You cannot have faith without some type of work. The two go hand in hand. And to do work without faith does not accomplish the desired goal. Let's say that Abel, that he had gone out and that he just, okay, I'm going to sacrifice like God said to sacrifice, but I really don't believe that's going to work. Well, that's not going to accomplish anything. That's not going to bring about righteousness. What about Abraham? Well, I'm going to go out, I'm going to leave my father's house, and I'm going to roam the countryside, but I really don't believe that God's going to get me where I need to go. Well, that's not going to have the desired result. That's not by faith. By faith, trusting what God has said, then we do. We perform, and there's no glorying that we can do except in what God has given for us to do. Now, when we're considering here in James chapter 2 and verse 22, this passage we were reading just a moment ago in Hebrews, and it's connected to his sojourning. He's called out of his father's house to go into a place which he does not know where he's going. But in James chapter 2 and verse 22, this actually has connection. This refers specifically to the offering up of Isaac. And that by his works, seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect. God had told Abraham, you go and sacrifice your only son. Now you're talking about having a lot of trust in what God has said. Abraham is already 100 years old, does not have any other children except for Isaac, and now he's being told, now I want you to kill it. Well, God, how are you going to perform your promise? How are you going to keep your promise if I kill this my only son? Abraham had faith. He trusted in God that even if he were to kill his son, the account in Acts, I believe it is, says that he actually had faith, or excuse me, it's actually in Hebrews. The account in Hebrew tells us that he had faith that God could raise him from the dead. And so what did Abraham do? He went through the process. They traveled to the mount, they carried wood, he carried his son, bound him up, and was even at the point where he was fixing to bring the striking blow. Could we say that Abraham had faith if he did none of those things? If he just stayed in his tent and said, well, okay, I believe you. No. Faith shows itself. And to be saved by faith, it's a faith that's actually going to do. How was Abraham saved? He was saved by faith in the promise. That he would produce seed, and that seed would grow into a great nation, and that through that seed, all nations of the earth would end up being blessed. How was he saved? By this faith, by keeping the commands and sacrifices which were authorized. You find them being obedient, doing what it is that God said. In John chapter 8 and verse 56, Jesus makes mention of this account and makes mention of Abraham. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Well, the Pharisees and the Jews, they did not understand what Jesus was referencing, and they raised the question, well, how could this be? Jesus is only such and such years old, never seen any of the patriarchs. Abraham saw it through the eye of faith. Offering up of Isaac, believing that God would be able to resurrect him. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19. And with the revelation of God delivering a sacrifice. When we're considering that when we sin, we deserve to die, but yet God says, instead of you dying, this animal is going to die in your place. And that God says to Abraham, offer to me your only son. But then what does God do? He gives a substitute. He gives a propitiation, an atonement. But Abraham walked every step of the way up that mountain, believing that, okay, I'm going to do what God says, and he's going to keep his promise. That's faith. And it's no different when we consider ourselves today and trying to fulfill what it is that God has given for us today. Now let's consider Moses. Abraham, now into the time frame of the law of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. And what shall I more say? For the time which failed me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, and of Samson, and Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Look at all these things that these individuals are doing. But yet, what does the Bible say that it is? They did these things by faith. The time would fail to speak of these things. Who through faith subdued kingdoms? Well, I've never been in battle, a physical battle, But from what I see it being depicted, that takes a lot of work. But it says this is through faith. Was there work involved? Yes, there's work involved. But faith comes before the work. Faith that God is going to provide. They wrought righteousness, obtained promises. That shows responsibility on their part. They obtained promises. Well, how? By faith. Stop the mouth of lions, so on and so forth. How were they saved under the law of Moses? The Hebrew writer tells us very clearly it's by the law of faith. Faith in God, not in the things in which God was telling them. Were they saved by faith like Abel, Abraham, and Isaac? Not exactly, because the commands are different. But it's still faith nonetheless. Faith was being expressed in different ways. But it's still being categorized and still being described to us as being saved by faith. So under the law of Moses, they had sacrifices. They had a priesthood. That wasn't the case during the time of Abel and Abraham. They had the tabernacle to then be moved to the temple. When they, through faith, implemented or practiced through these means, they were saved by the law of faith being under the law of Moses. Now, these are important factors for us to consider because of the mindset that a lot of people have today when it comes to trying to put together faith and works. A lot of people say that faith and works, they don't go together. Well, you're going to have a hard time with the book of James then. And even in Romans chapter 4, Paul is discussing a certain type of works. He's not just talking about all works in general, but he's talking about those type of works like he would be discussing in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2 about wisdom. Are we going by fleshly wisdom, earthly wisdom, or are we going by God's wisdom? Well, if it's God's wisdom, then we do not have any realm in which we're able to glory in any of those things. But we have individuals today that would look at us and say, well, if you've got to do A, B, C, D, E, and F, well, then you're just being legalistic. Well, if we're really stopping and considering what is going on even under the Old Testament system, there's nothing legalistic about a system that says you have to follow the commands. Now, as I said, we have this major problem in the religious world today. That if you start coming in and saying, well, you've got to do this, well, then you're legalistic and you don't have any grace. Well, we're going to do away with that. Many believe that law leads to legalism, but a legalistic system, just consider this point. Think about the Old Testament system. A legalistic system would not need sacrifices. Because if you're going to be legalistic, the law says you do this, you die. There would be no need of sacrifices. There would be, if you really get down to it in the Old Testament, there's no need of the book of Leviticus. There's no need of Leviticus. There's no need of the sacrifices. There's no need of a priesthood if we're just under a legalistic system. Because when you violate the law, the penalty of the law says that you die. There's no grace when it comes to what the law says. But yet we have plenty of accounts, plenty of information where people did break the law, but yet they did not die. Now, why did they not die? Let's just consider one of those names that was given to us in that list. Just consider David. David broke 2 of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, actually 3. Thou shalt not covet. And thou shalt not kill. I guess you break it down even 4. Thou shalt not steal. So as we go through this, we just add it on and on. Why was David not put to death? If we are just under a legalistic system. Right there you have, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And a legalistic system says you do this and you die. But yet David did not die. because having commands does not do away with grace. There was grace under the law, and it was grace that God was able to extend. Notice this. When we're considering David's character, we have plenty of scriptures that tell us that God is in fact looking on the hearts of man. And we are given at different points insight into what's going on to the inside of man. The only way that you know what's going on in the inside of me is if I tell you. Well, when we go to the Psalms, we are getting a full picture of what was going on of the inside of David during the time frame in which he was guilty of these sins. Notice Psalm 32 verses 1 and 2. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. When we go through the Psalms and we read specifically Psalm 32 and even Psalm 51 and Psalm 53, David is laying out his soul bare. That while those things were happening, David was being tormented. He was very sorrowful over what he did. He was not a rebellious individual in going through and committing adultery, committing murder, and then trying to cover up that murder through an act of war. So why was it that David wasn't killed on the spot even though he deserved to die? Because he was already a mourning individual. He knew what he did was wrong. And he was already penitent even before Nathan even showed up. When we have Psalm 32 verses 1 and 2 then being emphasized for us today, Paul uses those same words in Romans 4, 6 through 8. Even as David also describeth the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Were there commands that David had to follow? Yes, there were commands that David had to follow. Did he follow all of them perfectly? No, he did not follow all of them perfectly. How did he not die under a legalistic system? Because God had implemented, he had put in areas for grace. And that even when we're considering this event with David, David is confronted by Nathan the prophet, and Nathan goes through the illustration of the king that has massive herds of sheep. And he has a guest that comes over and he takes this one sheep that this one poor man has. And he slays it and he gives it to his guest at a feast. And Nathan asks David, what should happen to this king? And David says he should be put to death because he's stolen. All right, Nathan says, you're the man. God knows what you've done. David then confesses to these sins. He says flat out, I have sinned. And Nathan says to David, God has forgiven you. Well, how can that be? I haven't offered a sacrifice. I haven't shed blood. There's the context. How is it that how can God impute righteousness without works? David was forgiven before offering of a sacrifice. Why? Because God can do that. God can forgive and allow David to make that atoning sacrifice. We are learning early on throughout the Old Testament that it takes grace to save. David, everything that David did, he deserved to die. There was nothing good that David could do at that juncture to say before God, you can't kill me yet. It was simply by the grace of God. The only way that grace saves is by faith. Thus bringing us full circle to our text of Romans 4:16. Therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace. And faith is expressed in doing what God says to do. Abel was saved by faith in that he offered a sacrifice to God, and it was granted to him for righteousness. Abraham was saved by faith, being called of God to leave his father's house and to travel to sojourn in a land that he knew not where he went. Abraham obeyed. And during the time frame of Moses, with all of the laws that they had given to them by God for their protection, the law was good, but the law is not able to save. God is the one that saves. And so for us today, when we obey the gospel today, by hearing, believing, repenting, as God says that we are commanded to do in Acts 17 and verse 30, by confessing Jesus to be the Son of God, being baptized in water for the remission of sins, we are being saved by the law of faith. That if I obey, if I trust in what God has said, do these things, and I will save you. That's His grace. He doesn't have to save me. There's nothing to where God looks at me and just says, you know what, I owe this to Micah. He has, out of His goodness and His good pleasure, given me and all of us a way of escape. And that way of escape is, do as I say. Trust in what I'm saying. Have faith in what I'm saying. All right, if I'm going to have faith, then I'm going to do this. And all today are saved by faith in the blood of Christ. We have to be baptized in water, yes, but my faith is not in the water. Hebrews 9:15, and for this cause He is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. He's the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death. It's only through His death that we can receive the promise of eternal inheritance. As they were saved by obeying God, looking forward to Christ's coming, we are saved by obeying God through Christ accomplishing His work. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 12, we are told by the Apostle Paul that we are buried with Him in baptism, wherein also you are risen with Him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised Him from the dead. Our faith is to be in the operation of God. But God said the only way that He's going to operate is if you're in water. Why He chose water, I don't know. Other than the majority of our planet is made up of water, so it would be a good pick. But if God had chosen anything else, be baptized in goat's milk. Okay, I'm going to be baptized in goat's milk. What does goat's milk have to do with my sins? I don't know. Ultimately, nothing. The only thing that it does have to do with is what God says it has to do with it. And the fact that He says, do this, well, then I'm going to do it. It may be foolish to the world. It may be a stone of stumbling to those that think themselves wiser than God. I'm simply going to trust, have faith in what God said. And faith will save. Because faith which saves is a faith that will be obedient to what God has said. So this morning, as we conclude our time together, and we're being reminded of these things, let us be reminded to put our faith in that which saves us. It's going to be the blood of Christ which saves. But when we consider all that the blood of Christ has come into contact with, then we start realizing, we start piecing together all of these things that are important for us to be involved in. The blood of Christ has given us this New Testament. It's on His Word, so I need to make sure that I'm taking time to study it. We're coming together before the Lord's table in remembrance of His body and of His blood. That's something that the blood has come into has contact with and importance on. I need to be involved in that. The teachings in this Word as to how I'm to live my life on a daily basis. All of those things have the blood of Christ implemented, applied to them. So those things are going to save. So in being faithful and being obedient, we need to follow after these things. If there's anyone this morning that has not been keeping faithful to these things and is in need of prayers and encouragement, then we offer this time for you as we stand and as we sing together.